Strap yourselves in, because we're going to go on a journey of a discussion regarding people who think that only white people can have personal experience with Odin. That's right. It's time to explore Folkism, the white hand path. So, there are some polytheists out there that play a little game of gatekeeping with respect to who is allowed to practice our various faiths. And this is a very loud contingency that expresses itself across traditions, even in Christianity. But typically, polytheists that hold this belief are referred to as folkists. In heathenry, this will manifest as the idea that the religion is centered around an ancestral connection. They believe that the celebration of that ancestral connection is only possible if you have the right ancestors, that only certain kinds of souls can connect you to the gods, and that this is somehow factually the case. So let's talk about folkism. What is it? Where did it come from? And how is it addressed? Hellenic YouTuber and a personal friend of mine, Eliakai, and I have had a lot of conversations about this. This position affects her on multiple fronts because of her mixed background, which she explains in her video on this topic. But after going through the various definitions of folkism that exist, there wasn't one that I felt was clear enough to really capture what folkists actually believe as informed by their actions. And after a long back and forth with Eliakai, we coined this definition, that folkism is the belief that ancestral ties give benefit, privilege, or access to a religious tradition, especially in lieu of a living culture. Now, different traditions will employ this strategy in different ways, but most will try to play a game of ethnic separatism around their religion. And what makes it so sneaky is that they are basically cherry-picking to support their point. Whereas polytheism naturally acknowledges and even blends with other faiths, and often did historically, folkism denies this important fact of history to place humans in neat little boxes that do not reflect reality, currently or historically. To understand some of the roots of the current expression of this idea, we have to go back a few years. So, heathenry contains within it what is probably the most overt expression of folkism, and there's a lineage of this with respect to the way folkist rhetoric has ties going back to the Nazi supremacy narrative. This isn't an often talked about thing, but the Nazis did have a program to strip Christianity away from their culture. The problem, as they saw it, was that Jesus was Jewish and was the son of the God of the Jewish people. This obviously presented problems for the Nazis. So one of the ways that they tried to fix this issue was to build a transitional faith called positive Christianity. It eliminated the Old Testament and any other element of the Bible that they perceived as having Jewish authorship. And they went through phases of saying that Christ was Aryan or that Christ didn't exist, but this was supposed to be a transitional faith to a new one that was going to be more focused on the Nazi state, where Mein Kampf would replace the Bible and the swastika would replace the cross. So this program was led by a Nazi named Alfred Rosenberg, who is considered one of the more influential contributors to Nazi ideology. Rosenberg believed that religious and cultural transformation was cornerstone to the success of the Reich, but this program was eventually abandoned in large part because German preachers were not receptive. Christianity was split between those who called themselves German Christians, who supported positive Christianity, and the confessing church, who was in opposition to positive Christianity. And the project was considered largely unimportant, as the Nazis' major focus was mobilization for total war rather than a religious debate. So positive Christianity eventually died out when the Nazis lost the war. Now, why is this important? Because during this time, there was another faction called the German Faith Movement, which was small, but it was associated with the Nazi Party. It saw Hitler as a sort of savior. It implemented blood and soil rhetoric, but it was heavily influenced by Norse paganism. And its founder, Nazi Party member Jacob Wilhelm Hauer, died in 1962 and continued promoting the German Faith Movement well after the war. Carl Jung wrote an article entitled Wotan in 1936, which continued to influence white supremacist movements well after World War II. And in it, he discusses the subconscious archetype of the wild German spirit hiding in various expressions of German culture. And it even references Hitler unleashing the spirit of Wotan among the Germans young and old. And Jung references these aforementioned movements here, in which he talks about the nationalist God attacking Christianity and suggesting that German Christians were mistaken in their loyalty. He suggests that it would be better for them to join the German faith movement, describing them as decent and well-meaning people. And he notes that this would be preferable because Wotan is a German god, and therefore the god of the Germans. Now, these movements and the Wotan article would wind up influencing a man named Stephen McNallen, who is among the earlier Americans who revived Norse paganism on this side of the pond. He's a good speaker, he's a good writer, and an excellent propagandist. He has worked as a soldier, corrections officer, journalist, teacher, and spiritual leader over the course of his life. And his most recent work was with Red Ice TV, during which he often references the article that I mentioned earlier by Carl Jung. Let's take a look.
Tonight, I want to talk to you about race. Now, this is not meant to be a race discussion. This is meant to be a race discussion. But defeat brought with it only a more savage repression of the Wotan archetype. Germans were now to be peaceful factory workers busily creating an economic miracle, making money. The denazification program was ruthless and relentless. The Allies did everything in their power to bury Wotan's furious ecstasy under gross materialism. I told you about the Wotan Network, an organic, grassroots, long-term campaign to awaken the European-descended peoples. Our aim is to shake our folk from their slumber, to put iron in our collective backbones so we will stand up tall and proud and speak and act in our own defense. Ancestry is better than universalism. The Wotan archetype manifested in the revival of nationalism, Germanic mysticism, the occult lore of the runes, and folkish culture. Figures of Jesus on horseback were eerily similar to the repressed image of Wotan. I will defend my race. We white people face numerous threats to our future. Our numbers are shrinking in almost every location on Earth. Europe, our homeland, the place that gave us birth, will be majority non-white within a couple of decades unless, as I intend, we can change that situation. I believe we will see two things happen. First, there will be a violent reaction against the Islamification of Germany. Wotan will arise to defend his people. Although the average German may not want to admit it, the truth is clear. Even if not one more immigrant is allowed in Germany, there are already enough of them to change the face of Germany in the coming years and forever. If the politicians do not remove them, Wotan, whether you think of him as an archetype or as a god, will intervene to restore balance. Wotan now sleeps, but he will waken, and he will be ready for war.
Let me know what you think of this guy in the comments. But yeah, you can get a sense of his positions. And this isn't something new. Here's him from 1993 discussing myth as racial dreaming.
What a dream is to the individual, the myth is to the group. It's as though the whole culture, the whole tribe, the whole race dreamt. And that is their product. That is the content of that part of them that is not obvious.
In researching this project, I did a bit of a deep dive into McNallen's work and his history in order to understand the positions that he holds and who he is, which may warrant like a whole nother video, because what I found was just this daunting mess. But he is very much the definition of a folkist. He believes that the gods are rooted not only in our ancestors, but our very genetics, and he suggests that this is a scientific truth, and believes that evidence of this is suggested by similar behaviors of identical twins, crediting a psychic connection between them. Again, he holds this to be a scientific truth, or at least he wrote as much in the 80s. At the time, genetics was pretty mysterious. People didn't really understand it as much, so the ability to play hide the ball within a discussion of genetics was much easier. But I wound up getting a copy of this article on metagenetics some time ago, and it's interesting. I've had it in my possession for a few years now, and rereading it during my research on McNallen, it's important to note a couple of things about how he communicates, especially in comparison with his new book, Asatru, A Native European Spirituality, which was published in 2015. In 1985, he rejects the accusation of ethnocentrism while embracing that it was a positive thing in 2015. However, in 2015, he accounts that he's held the folkish position since 1974. And even in the 1985 article on metagenetics, in the paragraph following his rejection on ethnocentrism, he says, "Only by understanding who we are, only by coming from our racial center, can we interact justly with wisdom with other peoples on this planet." That's pretty ethnocentric. But we'll come back to metagenetics. But first, let's deal with McNallen and his organization.
I'm Steve McNallen, and I lead an organization called the Asatru Folk Assembly, or AFA.
During the height of McNallen's influence in Asatru, he was very careful with his wording. He seemed to be a sort of centrist in the world of the Aryan movement, outwardly refusing to express hatred or superiority over other races, yet holding this position of racial exclusivity in Asatru. Meanwhile, insisting that race is real, and these Jungian justifications about racial connection to the gods suggested that racial separatism was the way to go. He did, however, make some suggestions of racial supremacy in another article that he wrote entitled The Spiritual War for California and the Southwest, in which he cast the Aztec gods as the bloodthirsty soul of the Mexican people invading land that their gods covet. This is, of course, referencing immigration and justifying an ethno-nationalist colonialism. It's actually important to note, while we're reading this language, that this same justification of bloodthirsty Aztec gods is used by the Mexican government to deny rights to various indigenous peoples. But yeah, that's the kind of rhetoric that he's engaging with here. But he continues. It gets worse, actually. He also says that these gods have not reckoned with the likes of Odin and Thor or their followers. And the way that, the ending of this article is worded, it suggests an inherent superiority in the conflict, which, given his view of metagenetics, it's hard to reconcile with his smiling diplomatic words around respectful separatism. Meanwhile, he steps down from the leadership of the AFA and is replaced by a guy named Matt Flavel, or Flavel, I don't know how to freaking pronounce his name, who abandons all of that carefulness and goes straight to the typical racist and transphobic dog whistles. The heathen community at this point had made some efforts against Stephen McNallen, but his slipperiness on the subject largely kept people at bay. It was after Matt Flavel's statements that the AFA and McNallen were much easier targets. The evidence of their racism was succinct and in black and white, and from McNallen's successor, and without enough time for there to have been some sort of ideological change within the group. So Declaration 127 was made as a statement referencing the Havamal, which is more referencing than McNallen makes in any of his racial theories. But the text of Havamal 127 is as follows: "When you see misdeeds, speak out against them, and give your enemies no frith." Now, I've covered what frith is on this channel before. Essentially, what this means is that any respect that the AFA had as heathens is now over due to their misdeeds. They have in the past demonstrated racist, homophobic, and transphobic positions, and so their misdeeds should be called out, as they use our traditions to justify prejudice on the basis of race, nationality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Heathen organizations signed this document in droves. The SPLC went on to define the AFA as a hate group, and posted a lengthy article going into detail about folkism, which I highly advise reading for follow-up information. I've also included in the description an article from The Atlantic on folkism and its problems within heathenry. But is folkism valid? Is it just another iteration of heathenry? For a long time, this was kind of the case within heathenry, and among some it still is. But it shouldn't be accepted, and I'm going to provide 3 useful arguments as to why. The first argument is that history doesn't agree with this at all. Let's go back to metagenetics for a second. Metagenetics is, again, this idea that there's something hidden in genetics that connects us to the gods. And this is the cornerstone for justifying folkism. In 1985, McNallen discusses this as a scientific claim. In 1999, however, he reframes it as the hypothesis that there are spiritual and metaphysical implications to physical relatedness among humans which correlate with, but go beyond, the known limits of genetics. And he goes on to say that this means what he's talking about may or may not be in the DNA molecule, which means it's separate from genetics. But let's make something clear about the spiritual element of this claim. McNallen, in both of these documents, cites no sagas, sources, or examples from Norse history beyond a vague reference to the possibility of reincarnation in the Norse understanding, which, when you examine the Norse concept of death, this wasn't the most common view, and was only one of many. The overarching view about our ancestors is that in death we are reunited with them, whoever they may be, and there is no suggestion that there was ever any racial restriction on this expression of the afterlife. To suggest that there is a racial restriction on a tradition is a bold claim indeed, and to say that this is the ancestral intention and a simple reality of the nature of the gods? Surely there's some historical evidence for this, but there is none. In fact, we see the opposite. We see syncretic traditions showing up in pagan traditions all the time. The most notable counterexample to racial traditions would be the syncretism between the Egyptian and Roman pantheon, such as the worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis taking place in Britannia by Romans. Further, we see among various polytheist civilizations that it was customary for visitors of foreign lands to honor the gods of those lands while they were there alongside their own, which means that we have historical precedents of peoples engaging in praxis with deities not of their ancestral faith. And if this was something that was known in ancient times, why do we not see anyone in antiquity writing about it? Cicero writes pages of dialogue about the nature of the gods, and yet nothing about racial restrictions, or what delineating factors there might have been should these racial restrictions have even existed in the first place. But let's keep in mind, the modern notions of race did not exist in Rome. They had completely different ideas about the categories of peoples because, and write this down, race is a social construct. And the Romans had a different social construct than we do. And if you tried to describe white people to a Roman, they'd be very confused and maybe a little offended as to why you're lumping in Romans with the barbarous Gauls to the north.
Gods. I hate Gauls. My grandfather hated them too, even before they put out his eyes.
The second argument is philosophical. Folkism unjustifiably limits the gods. The idea that the gods are only accessible to people with certain ancestry is honestly insulting to the agency of the gods. Folkism puts forward the idea that Odin, the wise wanderer, the wild deity of ecstasy and pain, of poetry and death, is restricted into who he can reach out to among humans, and that this restriction is guided somehow by the magical correlate of DNA molecules referenced in absolutely no ancestral story. This seems absurd and is in dire need of some explanation. To suggest that any deity's actions are halted or allowed by magic contained in our DNA strands is nothing short of silly, especially when discussing gods like Odin or Freya, who command a system of magic that alters the threads of time. These beings are stopped by DNA strands? You may as well worship the DNA strands, which arguably is what folkists do anyway. This can only be informed by an incredibly low opinion of the gods indeed. And the only way that I can figure that McNallen came to this conclusion and just didn't question this element is that he just places a biblical-like authority in Jung over the gods, and then tries to conclude that this element of the DNA communication association is the explanation as to why Jung's article is true. Because with the amount that McNallen references Jung's Wotan article, it is obvious that he considers it like a holy text of some kind. But Jung didn't think of the gods in the same way that McNallen does. Jung thought of Wotan as a racial archetype for the will of the German people during the rise of National Socialism. McNallen thinks that Odin is a god, and yet thinks that Odin functions under these restrictions, and is married to this concept for whatever reason. It's just bad theology, and it was poorly thought through. But this doesn't compare to the third and probably most devastating argument against folkism, And that is that it just simply doesn't reflect reality. Because this is the kicker. People without European ancestors experience the Norse gods. People of mixed racial background experience the Norse gods. This falsifies metagenetics and ultimately folkism. The arbitrary bubble that folkists have placed around who can and cannot have access to their traditions is violated by the gods themselves. And on the AFA's website, they suggest that without white people, Asatru would no longer exist. Their reasoning for this is that all faiths spring forward out of their racial soul. It would follow from this that those without this ancestry would not experience the Norse gods. But they do. The AFA further makes the point that religions are not arbitrary or accidental, and proceed to ground this in evolution. But religions are not arbitrary because the gods are real, not because of evolution. What is arbitrary is changing your ancestral border for acceptance from Northern European folk to ethnic European folk, like the AFA did in 2017. I have said several times before that heathens grow out of the ground. We're not converted, we're called. And it seems that race is not at all a restrictive factor in this calling. If we are to in any way accept our own spiritual experiences as a justifier for our own religion, we must then accept the valid spiritual experiences as others, as justification for their religion. And the truth is, spiritual experience goes far outside the lines that folkists want it to. Humans can be folkists, but it seems that Odin is not. And oh, it is telling that folkists get their beliefs about these racial restrictions from McNallen, and not the sagas, or the gods. If you like this video, please go check out Aliyah Kai's follow-up. She explores this issue from another angle, and I'll be linking it and other videos on this subject from various polytheists in the description. And with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Like, subscribe, and remember to find a way or make one.